In the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night, in the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night.
Hello everyone, I'm Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. Before I get into today's review, first of all, the elephant in the room, provided that everything has been set up properly and I'm not completely screwing myself over right now, I have a new light and a new microphone, and I'm really upping the production of my videos from here on out. This is courtesy of my awesome sister who got me some new equipment for Christmas, so hopefully expect this kind of production value going forward. With that out of the way, a huge thank you to everyone who has entered my 400 subscriber contest so far. I've gotten a few comment entries as well as video entries from Sean Urshan and Have Cheetah Will View as of filming this, so if you want to check any of that out, I'll be linking the playlist of my 400 subscriber contest stuff below. Please feel free to enter. I'm hoping as many people enter as possible. So today I'm reviewing The Unholy. This is a movie that came out in 1988. It was directed by Camilo Villa, who I believe is or was a Cuban immigrant to America. He immigrated here at a young age and started a film career. This was probably the only horror movie he ever did, but outside from this film, he made $186 to Freedom, 5th of July, and Unlawful Passage. The movie stars Ben Cross, who was in the 2009 Star Trek movie, in the 1991 Dark Shadows series reboot, and in Exorcist: The Beginning. Claudia Robinson, this was evidently also her only horror role, but she was also in Wide Sargasso Sea, Harry and Son, and Troop Beverly Hills, to name a few. Hal Holbrook, who was in Magnum Force, Creepshow, and The Fog, and this features one of the few ever appearances of Nicole Fortier. The only other film that she has done, as far as I can tell, is a movie called Scared Stiff. This is another Vestron production, very much in line with the series of reviews I've been doing lately. This movie follows a priest who attempts suicide, only to seemingly decide not to jump out the window at the last moment, only to be pushed, but then also miraculously survive. Following that, he begins investigating the deaths of two fathers in this church that have come before him, and begins to suspect that there is a demon at work that is out there killing priests and other people who are pure of heart, and history is to some extent repeating itself. So the score for this movie, which was done by Roger Bellon, who did the music for the Highlander series, as well as working with Villa on 5th of July and doing music as recently as 2020 with a series called Quarantine. His score for this movie is very, very synth-heavy and classic 80s horror score, and it's very sort of fun in that respect, but it's this very haunting, dark, atmospheric take on 80s synth, as opposed to what I was talking about with Chopping Mall, where it's very playful. It's fun, but it's not upbeat. It's very down and dark and very deliberately creepy, but it also has these very interesting elements kind of mixed in there. We get a little bit of saxophone, there's a little bit of electric guitar. Because of the very religious theme that this film has, we have these gothic church-like elements to some of the music, things that sound very much like a pipe organ or very choral, but they're all filtered through 80s synth. There are also some actual choir parts on the soundtrack that add to that very gothic via Catholic feeling that this movie has. And we also get some actual music sung by the cast in one scene of this movie, where the congregants in this church where Father Michael, our main character, is father all start singing this gospel tune that I do not know the name of. All of the cast in there, provided they're not dubbed, all have really solid singing voices, which was a plus for me. The sets, costumes, and lighting in this movie are very sort of kitschy and artificial in a very sort of 80s way. You see this with a lot of especially low budget 80s horror, especially a lot of the movies I've been reviewing recently, but I like that kind of aesthetic, and this has that feel, but still manages to retain this very gothic atmosphere at the same time. And it's got this intense neon lighting in a lot of scenes that adds to that feel, especially like these very over-the-top, like deep blues in nighttime scenes. Very like Argento Suspiria lighting, not as completely crazy as Suspiria and some of Argento's other movies get with the lighting, but it gave me that same feel. And the cinematography in this movie is really good. It's not really anything too crazy or out of the way. We have some very sort of nice atmospheric tracking shots. As the movie progresses, some of the kind of camera work and visuals and editing that we get gets a lot crazier, and we get some really sort of bizarre, grotesque imagery as things descend further into madness. But this movie, despite the kind of cheese factor that it does have, really does hold back and gradually build up this bizarre atmosphere that it has, which I really liked. The club scene has that 80s neon aesthetic to it. There is a club in this film that is part like dance club, part like fetish club, part like Satanist cult. It's weird. And the vibe in there is very just the most outrageous 80s fashion combined with like stereotypical satanic cult stuff and like 80s punk to some extent. The atmosphere and the aesthetic of both the club scene, as in the scene in the film, and just the scene as in the people who go to the club, I really, really liked. The editing really does add to this movie in a lot of ways. Sometimes it feels a little much, but overall I really liked it. There is a jump scare very early on in this movie that legitimately got me. I really did jump. So there are some kind of weird jump cuts and interspersed cuts of things that we aren't going to see in the movie until later, that in that case in particular really work in some places in the movie, but in other places it starts to feel like they're just doing this for the sake of doing it. But on the whole, I liked that. I think it added to the intrigue of the film by showing you weird stuff that's going to happen later with no context for like 2 seconds and then making you wonder what's going to happen. There is not a lot of gore in this movie. Again, they do really hold back on that and let the atmosphere do a lot of the work in this. But when there is gore, it is intense, and it walks that perfect line between cheesy and legitimately gnarly. It is not so artificial as to take you out of what's happening, but it's not too realistic to lose any kind of fun factor for me. It really does balance the cheesiness and the artifice with the actual ick factor of what they're showing you. We have a few blind characters in this movie whose eyes are kind of glazed over with white. I thought that was a really simple but effective makeup effect. Because they are going a very slow burn route with this, we don't get a lot of actual monster or demon effects in this. But when we do, I'll be honest, they look kind of silly, but they look cheesy in the best 80s way possible. And they are just, at the same time, really well crafted. There's a lot of amazing texture to them. They look very sticky and gross, and they're being very well puppeteered. To some extent, it feels kind of tonally out of keeping with the rest of the movie, but the effects were just so cool and so fun that I didn't care. The few non-makeup effects we get in this are still very much on set, things moving around, lights flickering on and off, candles burning down way too fast. It's all stuff that's very, very tangible that you can tell is on set there with the person. While it feels very dreamlike and eerie, that little bit of tangibility and practicalness to it makes it all the more creepy and you can kind of feel the work that's put into it. You can feel the artifice of it to some extent, but at the same time, that just makes me appreciate the work that went into it more, and it never detracts from any of the storytelling that's going on or any of the atmosphere that the movie has. And story-wise, this movie deals with some really, really heavy themes right out of the gate. You've got our main character attempting suicide. There's existential crises of faith, right down to things like sexual assault, so serious trigger warnings for discussions about that. You don't see anything, thank God, but they do talk about it, and it's kind of heart-wrenching in places. It kind of felt like at the beginning for me, when they had the whole kind of suicide discussion, maybe they were using this demon that was trying to push this guy out the window as like a metaphor for someone's personal demons, but going into the movie more, I really don't think so, but it was worth a try. As I've talked about quite a bit already, this movie is more of a slow burn, but never not interesting. It's full of just constant weird occurrences and plot twists that keep you guessing as to what's happening. At least until the end of the movie, nothing is ever explicitly supernatural. You think it could just be someone screwing with this guy, or him having some mental issues, or other characters having mental issues. You're never quite sure. But it does just kind of use these little weird occurrences that get progressively weirder to build this very dreamlike atmosphere while still having a cohesive story, which was great. And the way this movie deals with religion is interesting. I have no idea what it's trying to say, but the way characters interact is really interesting, because you've got a priest who has been approached by a so-called Satanist, who is actually just this guy named Luke who works at this Satanist club. And it's pretty much just a gimmick for him, which was not an aspect of the movie I liked. At first I was like, oh, the priest and the Satanist having to work together to kind of fight the dark forces would be cool, but the whole him not actually being a Satanist kind of undercuts that for me. But they don't really start working together, and Father Michael just constantly suspects Luke of being behind everything, even though you really know he's not, and you're really not sure what the motives of the church are, or what the motives of the Satanists or Luke are, which really just adds to the intrigue of the plot, because it seems like really all sides just want the same thing, but there's this sense that there might be ulterior motives and you're just not sure. Speaking of religion, the church is kind of confusing, because in some ways it's very, very Catholic. They have this holy wafers and wine ceremony talking about the body of Christ, which feels very Catholic. But then there's the musical number I talked about, which is this very sort of gospel thing. I don't know what subset of Christianity this is supposed to be, but not knowing didn't take me out of the plot. It was just kind of weird. It really just does show this really interesting interaction between these very, very different beliefs throughout the different characters in this really interesting way, because you've got both Luke and Father Michael kind of wanting to get rid of this demon that they think is causing stuff. Luke is trying to go to him for help. Father Michael thinks Luke is still behind everything. The character that is really important that I forgot to mention, Millie, has kind of framed Luke for some stuff, but evidently she may have just been possessed and not meant to say any of that stuff. And at the same time, Father Michael, despite being the father in this church, does not believe in Satan or demons as real entities. He just believes that there is evil inside of everyone to some extent, and that is what devils and demons represent. But the rest of the church flat out tells him, you're going to have to do battle with this demon that's been attacking people, the Unholy, and it's going to be this very real, tangible thing, and you're going to literally have to duke it out with this thing in the middle of the church. And so even within this one kind of sect of belief, there's this divide. And then you've also got this detective character who is trying to figure out why priests have been dying at the same time every year, and he's trying to investigate, and the church isn't letting him because he's not part of the church, and he's just like, look, I know you guys deal in souls, I deal in bodies, and the bodies keep dropping this time every year, so I was an altar boy at one point, I know how the ceremonies go, just let me in here and figure this out, and they won't let him. So there's just all of these clashing different viewpoints on the same occurrences that really just add to this somewhat messy plot, but it doesn't feel messy to me. The plot threads don't all really resolve, but they're all set up really well, and everything flows together as a cohesive story that kept me interested the whole time. Towards the end of the movie, when things take a turn for the very, very supernatural, that's really not a spoiler, because we kind of know it's supernatural from the get-go because of the opening scene. Things do get a little bit overwrought. Father Michael is being very over-the-top and dramatic. This is when we get our monster effects. Everything becomes really over-the-top and cheesy to some extent, but it did not bother me. It flowed from the more subdued atmospheric aspect of the movie with a little bit of cheese into full-blown crazy supernatural ridiculousness in a way that didn't feel forced to me. It felt like a natural flow into this other weird tone. And we're also just getting legitimately weird, disturbing religious imagery that I think Clive Barker would envy to some extent. I haven't seen the Rawhead Rex movie, but to some extent there are things that happen that feel very Rawhead Rex, the book. Not as gross, but in that ballpark. I don't feel super attached to any particular characters in this. I don't identify with any one specific character, but I was engaged with the plot the whole time because everyone was acting their parts really well and the plot was just so strange and intriguing that I didn't mind. Nicole Fortier, who plays the demon, the titular Unholy, doesn't really have a lot to work with here. She basically just has to be sinister and seductive and appear in various states of undress throughout the film, but she plays the part really, really well. She kind of pantomimes this sinister demon appearing in a human form really solidly, and she is just a really aesthetically pleasing person to look at. So there's that. Probably the biggest downside to this movie is there is a little bit of racism to it. I'm probably not the best person to address the depiction of people of color in movies. Look at me. But I don't want to gloss over it either, so I kind of feel the need to talk about it. Specifically, the character of Teresa, played by Claudia Robinson. She's a very likable character, but she's kind of in this subservient role in the church, which was and her dialogue just feels very cringy and off. We've also got this Oracle character who foresees some future events at one point in the story, played by a woman of color, and she's a good actor. The character's kind of cool, but it does play into that like magical black person stereotype. It felt not quite right, even though the character was a likable and helpful one. And again, I'm probably not the best person to address that stuff, but it's there and it's not great, even though the actors are good. And this movie has some very, very fun characterizations in this. We have the character of the old blind priest who fervently believes in the demons and speaks with this very dramatic, wavering, slow voice with a lot of pauses in it, and he's really fun. And then we have Luke, the head of the Satanist club, who is supposed to be this very sinister, suave guy, but he has this southern drawl that he speaks in that is not at all what you would expect from him, and he just feels like a slightly sleazy businessman who's actually a decent guy and not this smooth-talking evil Satanist at all. And I just loved the characterization of Luke in this so much. And the character of Millie, who's kind of the love interest heroine in this, has this amazing scene in the movie, in my opinion, where she has been locked in this asylum because she kind of tried to stab Luke in the eyes. And she just has this crazy mental breakdown in front of Father Michael, who's trying to talk to her. She's like saying a million things just a mile a minute, getting into all these just really dark, traumatic past things that have happened to her, while also going into plot elements about hell and the darkness. And it's very over the top and dramatic, but you can just feel her pain and her terror, and she is just acting her heart out, and it's legitimately a hard thing to watch, which I thought was really impressive. So that is probably the best moment of acting in the film for me. Overall, this film is not perfect. I would say the ending kind of undercuts some of the crazy religiousness of this. The plot threads don't all resolve. There's some racism in here. Other than that, this is really a perfect movie for me. It just checks all the right boxes and it hits all the right spots. It's walking this balance between really atmospheric and dark and emotional with fun horror cheese fest in just this perfect way that creates this kind of nightmare quality to it that's very dark and very thought-provoking, but also really fun and playful. Of all the sort of Vestron releases out there and of all the movies on this box set, I'd never heard of this one. I wasn't expecting a lot. I knew nothing. This movie kind of blew me away with how impressive it was. So if you've not seen this movie, please do yourself a favor and seek it out and watch it. That is my review of the Unholy. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!